everybody? Got everyone? The execution of Stephen West has concluded. He was pronounced dead at 7:27 p.m. Central Time. As soon as our official media witnesses clear security, we will begin our press conference. I'd like to remind everyone, do not approach the official media witnesses until afterwards, and there will be no official interviews held on state property. Also want to remind you not to interview or approach any of our staff, and that there will be a 1-hour time period to which you will be permitted on property after the press conference before you will need to vacate the premise. Thank you.
The death sentence of Stephen West was executed by means of electrocution on August 15, 2019, in accordance with the laws of the state of Tennessee. The sentence was carried out at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution. Mr. West was pronounced dead at 7:27 p.m. I will now read a statement on behalf of the family. The statement: on the day of the execution of Stephen West, in remembrance of Wanda and Sheila Romines, and also Jack Romines. The statement is written by Mr. Eddie Campbell, nephew of Jack Romines. I will read the statement word for word as written. As for the execution of Mr. Stephen West, I am deeply sorry that any of his family had to go through such a horrible experience. I hope that he has made peace with God and has truly asked God for forgiveness for such a heinous crime that he was a part of. One of the worst things about this execution of Mr. West is that Mr. Ronnie Martin was not also included in the same punishment. Our family has suffered very deeply over the past 33 years through all the appeals that we think is very unfair for anyone to have to go through, when all of the proof in the world was there for the case to be over in 24 hours, let alone 33 years. I realize there are other families going through some of the same feelings and punishment that my family and I have had to experience very needlessly. Something in our judicial system has to be done to put a stop to all of this needless suffering for families of prolonged justice. I just wish that my uncle, Jack Romines, the father and husband of the two people that meant the most to him in his life, was so brutally murdered on March 17, 1986, could have lived long enough to know that the state of Tennessee finally brought justice in part for his loss. Uncle Jack passed away with a massive heart attack on February 25, 2008. He was only 69 years old and had to live his life without his wife and daughter for the last 22 years of his life, but he told me almost every day how much he missed them. I realize that one day or 22 years without a loved one is horrible enough, but having to go through all the reminders of the Court of Appeals and not knowing if justice will ever come or not is just too much for victims' families to have to deal with. I just hope and pray that our judicial system in Tennessee will consider the feelings of the victims' families that are still living in such a horrible situation and try to bring a speedy and correct justice to not only the families, but to the state of Tennessee as well. Most of our family is now deceased, but I have forgiveness in my heart for Mr. West and Mr. Martin, but I don't think that justice should be ignored. On behalf of my Uncle Jack Romines and the remaining members of our family, I hope this statement will be published in its entirety and not just in parts. Eddie Campbell, nephew of Jack Romines. We will now have a statement from Union County Sheriff Billy Breeding.
Hello, I would just like to say, as a lifelong Union County resident, I can remember when these crimes took place. It devastated and shocked our community. My father, who was a criminal investigator at the time at the Sheriff's Department, helped actually investigate this crime. I was contacted by Mr. Eddie Campbell, who asked me to come represent Jack Romines during this execution. I'm proud to say that justice has been carried out, and hopefully all families can get some closure. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Mattice with the Associated Press. At 7:15, the blinds were open to the execution chamber in the viewing area that we were sitting in. Mr. West was sitting there in the electric chair, harnessed in, wearing black glasses, barefoot, with sponges around his ankles. He was asked fairly quickly for any last words. His last words were, "In the beginning, God created man." He began weeping a little bit at this point and continued on. "And Jesus wept. That's all." At 7:16, some of the corrections officials put a towel behind Mr. West's neck. They soaked a sponge, a large sponge, put it on his head, and took his glasses off at that time. He was still weeping at that point. They put a black head harness on his head and strapped it around his chin. They wiped down his face from all the water that was dripping down from the large sponge at around 7:17. Then they buttoned on a black cover onto the harness that covered up his face during the execution. At 7:18, the corrections officials began wiping up the water that had dripped all over the floor, and they began to attach a line to the chair. At 7:19, a low buzz started going throughout the chamber, and Mr. West's body stiffened and his fists were clenched on the chair. He rose up a little bit out of the chair from the seating position in his chair. His right pinky was out and just kind of wrapped around the armrest on the right side. Maybe 20 seconds or so later, his body loosened and he came down. At 7:19 and about 50 seconds, his body stiffened again with the second rush of electricity that went through his body, similar to the first time. About 15 seconds later, his body went down and loosened again. His right pinky was still kind of grasped around that armrest, and he sat without moving. And we were told at that point that the time of death was 7:27.
Jonathan, if I'm not mistaken, you in the last year now have been able to see both lethal injection and electrocution. I wonder if you might be able to just briefly, in your thoughts, what struck you as the main differences in how these are carried out?
Well, the lethal injection that I witnessed was, I think, around 17 to 20 minutes. I forget the exact time. This was just a matter of seconds. Just a completely different visual to watch. You know, the inmate is looking at you during an electrocution, and during the lethal injection, they're lying down, kind of just looking upwards, basically, and it's, you know, various drugs are put into the system throughout that process. So it's just two completely different experiences. Thank you. Sure. Mattise. First name Jonathan, Jonathan. Thank you.
I'm Lori Tucker with WATE in Knoxville, the ABC station there, and as the witnesses were in the room, we saw the blinds coming up after we heard some activity behind the scenes, and we saw Stephen West in the chair, and he had a little look on his face. He looked at his attorney and kind of went, "This is it." The attorney was dabbing at her eyes, and you could see tears start to roll down Stephen West's face. And as we just heard, his last words that came rather quickly, in the beginning, God created man. And then he started sobbing, at one point almost uncontrollably. And then he said, "And Jesus wept." That's all. He seemed to stare at the galley for a moment, at those of us who were witnesses, and then lowered his head and continued to weep. His glasses were removed at that point. I want to point out, as you probably know, he was clean shaven. The sponge that was soaked in brine was placed on his head. It had already been placed on his ankles. His face was then covered with what is called a shroud. It was a cloth shroud. And then the connections were made, the current began. His body jolted once. His body lifted up in the chair for what seemed like several seconds, then lowered slowly. The second current, again, fist clenched, body rising, body lowering again. The third and final current, there was no movement from his body. We were waiting for the moment that the time of death was announced. At 7:25, the curtain was lowered At 7:27, we were told that was the time of death. Any questions?
Sorry, did you say there were 3 currents?
I noticed 3 currents.
Did you notice any motion, movement from him after the first one?
I noticed just a little as he was lowering back, but there was no movement that I saw the final time.
In the successive jolts in past electrocutions, witnesses said they seemed like the person rose up higher than the initial one. Did you seem to note that?
The first was higher, definitely. The second was less so, and as I said, the third, I did not detect much movement, if any.
Spell your name, please.
Lori, Lori Tucker.
Stephen Hale from the Nashville scene. Before I make my own comments, I have a statement from Stephen West's legal team that his attorney handed to me on our way out. My understanding is they're going to send this out to everyone, but I'm going to read it now. So again, this is from the legal team of Stephen West. It says, "We are deeply disappointed that the state of Tennessee has gone forward with the execution of a man whom the state had diagnosed with severe mental illness, a man of deep faith who has made a positive impact on those around him for decades, and a man who by overwhelming evidence did not commit these murders but has nevertheless taken personal responsibility for his involvement in these crimes. We don't believe the decisions of the courts and ultimately the governor reflect the forgiving and merciful citizens of this state." So again, that's from the legal team of Stephen West, and I believe they'll send this out. I have this. Anyone can take it down if you want. Other than that, I would mostly echo everything my colleagues have said about his final statement. I would emphasize that it was very difficult to watch a man weeping in the electric chair. He was beside himself, and that was evident. The only thing I would note is that I know there was some discussion about how many times the current went. I only noted 2 of those. I don't know. I don't want to. It can be a little hard to tell what's going on there, but that's what I saw and that's what I heard. Like I said, I don't want to tell you more. I confirm what my colleagues have said. I guess I can take questions if you have any. But
Steve, you witnessed 3 executions here in just about the last year, both electrocution and lethal injection. Just your thoughts on comparing the two methods from what you've been able to see?
yeah, I agree with what Jonathan said. The lethal injection was a much longer process, slower, and I think I may have said this previously, but you can see the inmate's face during lethal injection. During the electrocution, they have the veil over their face, and of course before that though, they're facing you, and so we could see his face. We could see him looking at his attorney, and we could see him again crying. So that was quite different. The only other thing I would say is, I don't think I'll be coming out to another one of these. But I think it's very important that people bear witness to these, and that's why it's meant a lot to me to do it and why I felt strongly about it. But I think I'll probably be taking a break. Maybe the governor or someone can take my seat if they want, but I think I'm probably done for now. So.
I'm Kathleen Jacob with Fox 17 here in Nashville. A lot of what I'm going to say is what you guys have already heard. Something to add though, before the curtain came up, you could hear something over the speaker. It sounded like a woman saying, "We all love you," likely his attorney, if that's what she said. When the curtains came up at 7:15, we saw him sitting probably the distance from where I am to where you guys are is how far he was from the media witnesses. Strapped in, the sponges were on his ankles. Like someone else said, he was completely shaven at that point. When they asked at 7:16 for his last words, like like everyone else has said, he quoted, "In the beginning," right after he said that, he started sobbing. He said, "God created man and Jesus wept." During that whole thing, he continued to cry. Right after that is when they put the sponge on his head and they took his glasses off. He had a lot of water running down his face. They were wiping the water from him. At 7:17, before they started doing anything, to me it sounded, they had already put the black piece of felt on him, but so we couldn't see his face, but to me it sounded like I heard him sob again. At 7:18, that's when they plugged the cord in. At 7:19, it almost sounded like an elevator sound, the current coming through. You see him tense up, clench his fists. I noticed his left fist was completely clenched. His right, not so much, but that pinky did stay out. About 15 seconds later, he slumped down. Again at 7:19, and about 50 seconds, the second current came on. He tensed up again. Same thing with his right pinky kind of resting on the armrest. And then 7:20:07, he slumped down again. 7:25, they put the curtain down and then announced 7:27, time of death.
Can you talk about what you saw in relation to kind of what you might have been expecting looking in?
You know, I think for me the biggest surprise was how close he was to us and staring kind of straight at us. And from past executions and things that we've heard, when it comes to final words, we don't normally see them sobbing and crying. So that kind of took me aback in that moment. So that was kind of something that I didn't expect, to just be that up close and personal.
I'm Justin McDuffie with WVLT News in Knoxville, the CBS station. We were entered into the witness room around 6:53. You could hear some movement coming in from the execution room. At 7:15, the window opened. We were staring through 4 glass panes, looking into Stephen West's eyes. You could see him sitting there. He was red in the face. It looked like he had been crying previously or had been upset previously. He was red in the face, completely shaven. He had his glasses on. That's when his final words were said. The warden asked if there were any final words. In the beginning, he kind of took a pause. Seemed like he was about to start sobbing once again. He said, "God created man," and then he said, "Jesus wept." That's all. They placed that towel around his neck and placed this large, this very large, just almost sopping sea sponge on top of his head, and that's when water just began rushing down his face. They then placed the helmet on. It almost looks like an old football helmet, leather with a wire out of the top of it. Then they strapped it down with a chin strap, just like a football helmet. Then they placed the veil over his face, and that was the last time that we were able to see Stephen West's face. Before they put that veil on, they wiped his face profusely. Then we saw the guards take what looked like condiment bottles and squirt water on the sponges that were already placed around his ankles. Shortly after that, we saw Department of Corrections employee plug the current into the chair. Shortly after that, we heard a hum of some sort. It sounded like the electric current had been turned on at that point. The first jolt, we saw Stephen West's body tense up. His fingers kind of made a fist almost. One of his pinky finger on his right hand kind of stayed out a little bit. He relaxed down shortly after that. Next jolt came in, same thing, body tensed up, fingers curled up. Didn't notice anything with his feet curling, but shortly after that he fell back into that chair. And then from that point on, there was no sign of life, no anything coming from Stephen West. So that's it. Any questions? I have been a witness to an execution. I was a witness to a lethal injection in the state of Georgia. I I assume that you're going to ask, how does this compare? I will echo what my other colleagues have said. This process was over in a matter of less than 2 minutes. I mean, this was something that the current hit, and there was no other sign of life once he tensed back or relaxed back down in that chair. And I think the second one, didn't really do anything. I think the job had already been done at that point, versus the lethal injection process took 15-20 minutes, and that whole time you're watching those breaths, those deep breaths, and you're hearing sounds almost gasping for air sometimes during that lethal injection process. So this, to me, was much quicker during that process.
Past witnesses say, talk about some facial expressions or even interactions between the guards while they're putting that sponge on and maybe some of the brine running down their face. Is there any kind of motion or any kind of interaction at all when that was happening?
I don't believe there's any sort of interaction between him and the guards. The only real interaction, I saw him glance into the audience with us. He made eye contact with what appeared to be his attorney. There was also a relative of his family in the audience with us watching this execution. Not quite sure what her relationship was, but he did make eye contact with them. You could tell that he was sobbing at that point. He was very emotional during this whole time, and as that water was coming down, it was just adding to the tears in his face. That water just dripping down. It almost looked like he couldn't stop sweating. It was just so much water. That sponge was so soaking wet. It just fell all the way down. Right before they covered his face, they wiped his face down. Then they covered his face with that veil, and that's the last time we saw Stephen West.
Hi, my name's Chaz Sisk. I'm with Nashville Public Radio. I'm, I guess, the sixth person to come up here and share their thoughts, so I'm just going to cut to a couple things. I'm fairly certain what we heard at 7:19 was the exhaust fan coming on. According to the protocol, that would have been the time in which that would have come on. The current itself made no sound, as far as I could tell. The current came at about 15 seconds after the exhaust fan went on. It ran for 20 seconds, which is in keeping with the protocol for the state. There was a 15-second lapse between the two. Then there was a second current of about 15 seconds. Didn't observe any movement after that. Each time the current flowed, those 2 times, he tensed up, lifted his body up, so it was fairly clear. Saw no movement in the 5 minutes that the curtain was open after the end of the execution procedure. And the time of death, as we said, was 7:27. So if there's anything anybody needs clarification on, I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Same question, just I know that you had witnessed actually just your thoughts on how it was carried out.
Well, I think, as my other colleagues have said, the speed of it is remarkable. Is probably the most remarkable difference. The proximity of the condemned to you is also, he's facing you as opposed to lethal injection where he was faced sideways. I believe the lethal injection protocol is about 11 minutes to go through the 3-drug protocol, whereas this was 50 seconds from the time the current began to when it appeared to be over. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Matt Lakin. I'm from the Knoxville News Sentinel. I don't have a lot to add. I saw the same thing the previous 6 people saw. Heard the last words. In the beginning, God created man, and Jesus wept. That's all. He was crying. He saw the current turned on twice. Saw him stiffen and go limp. It was over, as they said, very quickly. Any questions? I have, yes.
Was there anything in this one that stood out to you more than
The last man I saw electrocuted didn't seem to care. This one was tearful. So this one showed some emotion. Anybody else?
That concludes our press conference. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there should be no interviews of official media witnesses here on state property. Feel free to try to arrange that off property if you want, but again, no official media witness interviews here on property. You'll have until 10 minutes after 9 before you will need to vacate the premise. Thank you.